At the beginning of the 20th century, Los Angeles was undergoing an explosive transformation. What was once a small desert town was rapidly becoming one of the fastest-growing urban centers in the United States. People arrived in massive numbers, industries emerged, neighborhoods expanded quickly. But there was one critical problem threatening to halt this growth: water. The region simply did not have enough water resources to sustain the future being envisioned. Without an urgent solution, Los Angeles risked collapsing before ever reaching its peak. It was within this environment of urgency, ambition, and political pressure that the idea for a project deemed essential to the city's survival was born: the St. Francis Dam. More than an engineering structure, the dam represented a promise of control over nature, water security, and limitless progress. It was part of a broader water supply system designed to ensure that Los Angeles would never again face scarcity. At the time, the project was celebrated as a symbol of human intelligence and technological advancement. Leading this vision was William Mulholland, the most powerful figure in California's water engineering history. Revered as a hero, Mulholland was responsible for major achievements in supplying water to the city. His word carried absolute authority. When he approved a project, few dared to question it. The St. Francis Dam quickly came to be seen as inevitable, not just necessary but urgent. The city's growth could not wait for lengthy studies, excessive reviews, or delays. Each day without water meant economic loss and political risk. Gradually, haste began to outweigh caution. Before we continue, if you appreciate real stories that expose human error, ambition, and the hidden consequences of progress, subscribe now to the Wrong Project channel. Also, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. How far should humanity go to control nature? What few realized at the time was that the St. Francis Dam was not being built solely on concrete and calculations. It was being constructed on overconfidence, centralized decision-making, and the dangerous belief that large projects do not fail when guided by great names. This was the beginning of a story that promised to save millions of lives, but would ultimately be remembered as one of the greatest engineering disasters of the modern era. To understand how the St. Francis Dam came into existence, it is essential to understand who was in charge. William Mulholland was not just an engineer. He was a nearly mythical figure in Los Angeles, a man who had transformed the city's destiny by bringing water from distant regions, allowing the desert to bloom. To many, he was incapable of failure. Mulholland did not have a traditional academic engineering background. His knowledge came from hands-on experience and decades working directly with water systems. What was once seen as proof of self-taught brilliance eventually became a critical weakness. He trusted his intuition more than external analysis, and his authority was rarely challenged. By the time the St. Francis Dam was being built, Mulholland held immense power. He supervised projects, approved technical decisions, and exerted direct influence over politicians and financiers. Questioning his choices was not just difficult, it was almost unthinkable. Younger engineers and geological specialists were reluctant to openly disagree. The dam's design underwent significant changes during construction. Its height was increased to store more water, but this decision was not accompanied by a full structural recalculation. Critical adjustments were made without in-depth analysis of how the additional pressure would affect the dam's foundation and surrounding terrain. Another alarming factor was the choice of location. The San Francisquito Canyon had complex geological characteristics, including unstable rock layers and ancient fault lines. Preliminary reports indicated risks, but these warnings were downplayed. Mulholland believed that concrete and engineering skill would be enough to overcome any natural obstacle. This overconfidence created a dangerous environment. The dam was not merely a technical project, it became an extension of human ego, the belief that experience and reputation could replace caution and independent verification. As the structure rose, so did the silent possibility of irreversible error. But at that moment, no one wanted to hear bad news. The city needed water. The system had to work, and the man in charge could not fail. The construction of the St. Francis Dam began under an atmosphere of absolute confidence. The project moved forward rapidly, driven by the urgency to supply water to Los Angeles, and by the belief that all major risks had already been addressed. However, from the earlier stages of construction, warning signs began to emerge. Signs that, if properly analyzed, could have completely changed the outcome of this story. The chosen design was a concrete gravity dam intended to resist water pressure solely through its own weight. This type of structure requires extremely stable foundations, as any weakness in the ground can compromise the entire dam. Even so, detailed geological studies of the San Francisquito Canyon were superficial. Speed took precedence over caution. During foundation excavation, workers encountered fragile rock formations and layers that crumbled easily. In some areas, the rock absorbed water in unusual ways. These findings were documented, but interpreted as minor issues, solvable with additional concrete and improvised adjustments. The logic was simple and dangerous. If something appeared weak, it could simply be reinforced. As the dam grew taller, leaks began to appear. Small streams of water seeped through concrete joints and the base of the structure. For concrete dams, some leakage can be normal, but in the case of the St. Francis Dam, these leaks appeared even before the reservoir reached full capacity. Some engineers and workers expressed concern. Questions arose about the added pressure and the land's true ability to support the increasing weight of water. However, these doubts never gained formal traction. The project was too advanced, too expensive, and too politically important to be stopped. William Mulholland regularly visited the site and interpreted the leaks as a common occurrence. He stated that every large dam experienced initial seepage and that there was no cause for alarm. His confidence reassured authorities and silenced dissenting voices. What no one fully realized was that the water was not merely leaking. It was seeping deep into the foundation rock, altering its structure and reducing its strength. Every drop that passed through was not just an escape, but a warning that something fundamental was being ignored. The St. Francis Dam was nearing completion, but alongside it, a silent mistake was solidifying. An error growing invisibly, sustained by haste, overconfidence, and the refusal to admit that something might be wrong. Behind the apparent solidity of the St. Francis Dam, there was a silent enemy that could not be defeated with more concrete: the geology of the San Francisquito Canyon. Unlike visible structural flaws, geological problems rarely reveal themselves immediately. They manifest slowly, often only when it is already too late. The chosen site for the dam was composed of a dangerous combination of ancient sedimentary rocks, fractured schist, and unstable conglomerates. These formations had been shaped by millions of years of tectonic activity and erosion. While they appeared solid at first glance, many of them disintegrated when exposed to prolonged contact with water. One side of the canyon, particularly the eastern abutment, contained an old formation known for its weakness when saturated. This characteristic was known to geologists at the time, but was not given proper consideration during project planning. The focus remained on the visible structure of the dam, not on the invisible behavior of the ground supporting it. As the reservoir began to fill, water exerted immense pressure not only against the face of the dam, but also against the surrounding and underlying rock. Continuous seepage started to weaken the foundation, creating zones of instability that could not be detected with the naked eye. The problem worsened when the dam's height was increased during construction. This addition significantly raised hydrostatic pressure without a full reassessment of the site's geological capacity. Simply put, additional weight was being applied to ground that had already shown signs of fragility. Later reports indicated that cracks began to appear in nearby slopes. Small landslides and subtle noises were observed by workers, but were interpreted as common natural events in mountainous areas. No official alarm was raised. The invisible error was taking shape. It was not a single isolated factor, but a lethal combination. Unstable rock, constant water infiltration, increased pressure, and the absence of independent geological review. The dam appeared firm, but its foundation was slowly being compromised. The St. Francis Dam disaster was not caused solely by direct human mistakes. It was the result of choosing to ignore what could not be easily seen, the complexity of nature and its limits. While the structure still stood, destruction was already underway, silent and inevitable. By early 1928, the St. Francis Dam was officially completed. The imposing structure stretched across the San Francisquito Canyon as a symbol of modern engineering triumph. For Los Angeles authorities, the project represented safety, growth, and definitive control over the city's water supply. However, the most critical phase of any dam was still ahead: the filling of the reservoir. As water began to accumulate behind the dam, enormous forces came into play. Each additional meter of water level exponentially increased the pressure exerted against the structure and, most importantly, against its foundation. It is during this stage that hidden flaws typically reveal themselves. In the case of the St. Francis Dam, those flaws were already present, merely waiting for the right moment. During the filling process, leaks became more visible and more frequent. Streams of water appeared at specific points along the dam, some carrying a cloudy coloration, indicating that soil and rock particles were being washed away with the flow. To dam specialists, this type of seepage should have been treated as a serious warning sign of instability. Even so, the leaks continued to be downplayed. The official interpretation was that such behavior was normal for a newly constructed dam. William Mulholland was called to evaluate the situation and, after visual inspections, reaffirmed that there was no imminent danger. Once again, his word was enough to silence deeper technical debate. The water level continued to rise. Along with it came increased saturation of the surrounding rock, especially on the eastern side of the canyon. Water penetrated invisible fissures, widening fractures and reducing the strength of the ground. This process occurred slowly, without dramatic noises or obvious external signs. Meanwhile, communities located downstream of the dam continued their daily routines, unaware of the growing risk looming above them. Farms, small settlements and workers slept beneath the false sense of security provided by a structure considered modern and reliable. The St. Francis Dam had passed the construction phase. It was now entering the most dangerous stage of its existence, a phase in which past decisions, ignored errors, and invisible flaws began to accumulate under millions of tons of stored water. The disaster had not yet occurred, but the conditions for it were nearly complete. All that remained was one final push from nature, or from the weight of the project itself, to transform a celebrated work into a historic tragedy. On March 12, 1928, the St. Francis Dam was nearly at full capacity. Millions of tons of water were silently pressing against the structure, accumulating forces invisible to the naked eye. In response to increasing leaks and troubling reports from the site, William Mulholland decided to conduct a final personal inspection. The visit took place just hours before the disaster. Mulholland walked along the dam, accompanied by his assistant and local representatives. They observed the seepage points, examined the concrete face, and visually assessed the structure. Water flowing from the base, in some areas dark in color, was once again interpreted as normal behavior. No in-depth technical measurements were conducted. There were no pressure tests, no additional geological analysis, and no preventive evacuation of downstream areas. The inspection relied almost entirely on Mulholland's personal experience and his conviction that the dam was safe. After the visit, he declared that the structure posed no immediate risk of collapse. This statement was communicated to local authorities and reinforced the sense of security among workers and residents in the region. Any possibility of disaster appeared officially dismissed. What made this situation even more critical was the fact that the dam had been approved less than 24 hours before its complete destruction. There was no time for review, questioning, or reaction. Absolute trust in the judgment of a single man sealed the fate of hundreds of people. As night fell over the San Francisquito Canyon, the dam remained silent. There were no clear visual signs that something was about to happen. No sirens, no warnings, no evacuation. The apparent calm concealed a structure on the brink of collapse. The false sense of security created by the final inspection played a decisive role in the tragedy. Had there been any official doubt, any evacuation order, many lives could have been saved. But the belief that everything was under control prevailed. Hours later, that certainty would be destroyed along with the dam's concrete. What had been approved as safe would, within minutes, become one of the greatest engineering catastrophes in history. And the silence of the night would be shattered by a force impossible to contain. Shortly before midnight on March 12-13, 1928, the St. Francis Dam ceased to exist. Without warning, without time to react, and without any chance of defense, the structure failed catastrophically. The collapse was not gradual, it was total. The central section of the dam violently broke apart, releasing millions of cubic meters of stored water within minutes. A liquid wall mixed with concrete, rocks, and debris surged through the San Francisquito Canyon with unimaginable force. The initial wave reached dozens of meters in height. The speed of the water was so extreme that entire structures were torn from the ground. Houses were instantly crushed. Century-old trees were ripped out by their roots, and massive blocks of concrete from the dam itself were hurled for miles. Everything in the path of the flood was simply erased. Workers living near the dam had no chance of survival. Many were asleep when the wave struck. Others heard a deep roar, similar to an earthquake, seconds before being swallowed by darkness. There were no warning cries. There was no time to run. The water rapidly advanced through the Santa Clara River Valley, striking farms, villages, and workers' camps. In some areas, the flood reached locations more than 80 kilometers downstream. The destructive flow continued for hours, leaving behind a trail of absolute devastation. The darkness of night made the disaster even worse. With inadequate lighting and limited communication, survivors wandered through the wreckage, searching for family members and neighbors. Many bodies were never found. Others were discovered days later, trapped in trees, buried in mud, or carried all the way to the Pacific Ocean. In just a few hours, a project once celebrated as safe and modern was transformed into a war zone. The St. Francis Dam did not merely fail, it virtually vanished, leaving only scattered fragments of concrete as silent witnesses to the tragedy. That night, progress revealed its cruelest face, and the cost of blind trust was paid in human lives, brutally and irreversibly. When dawn broke on March 13, 1928, the scene along the Santa Clara River Valley was unrecognizable. Where farms, roads, and entire communities once stood, there was now only mud, debris, and silence. The force of the water had completely reshaped the landscape, erasing any sense of normalcy. The first rescue teams arrived in the early morning hours. Firefighters, police officers, volunteers, and local residents struggled to move across unstable terrain covered in thick mud and wreckage. In many areas, it was impossible to distinguish where a road, a home, or a cultivated field had once been. Everything had been flattened by the flood. The search for survivors was desperate and chaotic. People shouted the names of loved ones, tore through debris with their bare hands, and dug through mud without proper equipment. Every sound was treated as a possible sign of life. Every body recovered was a brutal confirmation of the scale of the tragedy. Many survivors were in deep shock. Some had lost their entire families in a matter of seconds. Others wandered aimlessly, unable to comprehend what had happened during the night. Stories began to emerge of people clinging to trees, pieces of wood, or improvised rooftops, revealing accounts of survival that seemed almost impossible. Counting the dead proved extremely difficult. Many migrant workers lived in informal camps along the valley and were not listed in official records. Bodies continued to be discovered days and even weeks later, some dozens of kilometers from the collapse site. The water had taken lives and identities. Authorities initially released conservative figures, but it soon became clear that the disaster ranked among the deadliest in California's history. The emotional impact was devastating. Collective funerals were held, and entire communities had to be rebuilt from scratch. As survivors struggled with grief, an unavoidable question emerged. How could something considered safe fail so completely? Trust in progress and modern engineering had been deeply shaken. The St. Francis Dam was no longer just a physical ruin. It had become a symbol of loss, error, and human suffering. The dawn did not bring relief. It brought awareness, and with it, the painful realization that the tragedy could have been prevented. Just days after the collapse of the St. Francis Dam, one of the largest technical investigations ever conducted in the United States, began. Public pressure was intense. Society demanded answers, accountability, and clear explanations for a disaster that had killed hundreds of people in a single night. An official commission was formed to analyze the causes of the collapse. Engineers, geologists, and independent specialists examined the dam's remains, the surrounding terrain, and project records. What they uncovered revealed an alarming sequence of errors accumulated over the years. The conclusions indicated that the primary cause of the disaster was not the concrete itself, but the failure of the foundation. The canyon's geology had been severely underestimated. The rock beneath the dam, particularly on the eastern side, became unstable when saturated by reservoir water. This caused foundation movement and total structural collapse. Another critical point highlighted by the investigation was the increase in the dam's height during construction without proper revision of safety calculations. This change drastically increased hydrostatic pressure, pushing the project beyond its originally intended safety limits. The Commission also strongly criticized the absence of independent oversight. William Mulholland held excessive authority, making technical decisions without external review. In a project of this scale, the concentration of power was deemed a decisive factor in the failure. Mulholland was called to testify. In a historic moment, he accepted moral responsibility for the disaster. He stated that if there was human error, the error was his. Despite this, no criminal charges were formally brought against him. At the time, existing laws did not clearly define accountability for systemic engineering failures. The investigation made it clear that the St. Francis Dam disaster was not an unforeseeable accident. It was the result of human decisions, flawed technical choices, and the refusal to heed expert warnings. The tragedy exposed the devastating consequences of blind trust and the absence of institutional control. The findings shocked the nation and deeply damaged the image of engineering as an infallible force. For the first time, it became evident that major projects fail, not only due to isolated technical mistakes, but because entire systems collapse when questioning is suppressed. The collapse of the St. Francis Dam marked a turning point in the history of modern engineering. Although hundreds of lives were tragically lost, the disaster exposed structural failures not only in concrete, but in the entire decision-making system that guided large-scale projects in the early 20th century. After the tragedy, engineering standards underwent profound changes. Detailed geological studies became mandatory for dam projects. The era of the single, unquestioned engineer began to give way to multidisciplinary teams, independent reviews, and stricter oversight processes. The St. Francis Dam became a case study still taught today as an example of what must never be ignored. The name William Mulholland, once celebrated as a symbol of progress, came to carry a permanent shadow. Although he was never criminally convicted, his career ended with the disaster. In his later years, he lived in isolation, burdened by the moral weight of hundreds of deaths. His final silence became part of the tragedy's legacy. Physically, remnants of the dam still exist. Concrete fragments remain scattered throughout the San Francisquito Canyon like open scars on the landscape. They are not merely ruins. They are silent memorials to collective human failure. More than a technical error, the St. Francis Dam stands as a timeless warning. It reveals the dangers of arrogance, haste, and the belief that technology can dominate nature without consequences. The disaster did not happen simply because the dam collapsed, but because no one chose to listen when there was still time. Stories like this show that progress, when not accompanied by responsibility, humility, and questioning, can become destructive. Every major project carries invisible risks, and ignoring them is a way of repeating the mistakes of the past. The St. Francis Dam was designed to save a city. Instead, it entered history as a dark reminder. When humanity believes it stands above natural limits, the price is always paid in lives. This is not just a story about a dam, it is a story about choices, and about how decisions made in silence can echo for generations.